Good evening, friends. Welcome back to Dave's Hobby Barn and Basement and the second installment in our Nacelle build on the T1 Models 120mm EDF Conversion. I wanted to start out by saying I have completed the left side pod, and I want to just pick up where I left off in our previous video with I have the rails installed. The pod is complete, so I'm going to walk you through the process of what it took to do the final installation. Let me get this lifted up, and as you can see, everything has been installed, trimmed accordingly, and measured. Now all is set correctly and centered. Let me stand this up. It'll make it a little easier to walk through this. Now, as you can see, I installed on each side the new rails for mounting the EDF. I had to trim off 35 millimeters of the exhaust cone. And again, you can see where I made some reference marks on the thrust tube to make sure that I got that correct. The other thing I discovered was not only does it have a thrust angle, but the back of the cone matches the back of the nacelle. So what I did to ensure it was correct was I measured from the back of the nacelle to the back of the cone. It's not exact, but it's very close. As long as you follow the thrust angle that's in here and the back of the cone, it should come out. What it looks like is that the seam lines are the top centers. So if you follow the seam line and double check it, it should come out and maintain your thrust line. So ultimately, this is a three-step process. You have to trim the front of the nacelle, as I had talked about previously. You have to take 20 millimeters off of the front of the nacelle. You'll have to take 35 millimeters off of the thrust tube. Now this is if you're using Schubeler. If you're using a different fan unit, you may have to make some adjustments. After my high sol dried and I got my mounts in, I set my cone in the front, set the fan in, and I laid it face down to make sure it all centered. Marked my holes. Those are M3 bolts that I installed blind nuts behind on the bottom after I made sure everything was correct with the thrust tube, and then of course subsequently put some some thick CA to make sure those stayed in the bottom. I used thin CA on the top of the mounts to make sure they were hardened, and then made sure everything was tapped correctly. Everything worked, and yes, I pre-fit everything. Of course, I added my wiring to the Schubeler fan to make sure it was correct. The next step is you have to feed the thrust tube in. It will push back until it stops up against the firewall that's inside of the nacelle in here. It's kind of hard to show you inside, but if you look, you can see it back there. It will not go, it'll only go back about that far from the back of the thrust tube, which is one of the reasons you have to trim this to 35 millimeters. So what happens subsequently is you put the thrust tube all the way back as far as you can get it. You slide it back. Then the next thing you have to do is install the Schubeler fan, set it so that it fits down in, tilt it, so then you can put your front piece into it so that it all fits into place. Then put your cone onto the front of the fan, slide your thrust tube over top of it, and then you can push the whole unit together. That was how I test fit it. In order to get the Gorilla Tape on, of course, you slide this back, and the fan will actually, the way it mounts, you can turn it counterclockwise enough that you can get plenty, and I used Gorilla Tape, plenty of Gorilla Tape around the thrust tube on the back of the fan unit to hold it in place. And I also did the same thing on the front, and that all held it. I think when I'm all finished and I'm satisfied, I will probably use some black RTV, some silicone in the front where this meets against the nacelle, just in case there's a little bit of vibration. There is a little bit of gap in a couple of spots. You know, nobody's perfect when they cut, including me. But overall, that should work perfectly. The assembly is tight. There were no gaps. I did paint the back of this, obviously. Got to make it look more realistic. Anyway, make sure, though, after you put your wiring in, that you add some snakeskin or some type of protection to your wiring when it comes out the bottom of the nacelle so that it doesn't rub. I didn't happen to have any snakeskin, but I did have that plastic wire coating that we use in automotive, and it works just fine. So I have my wires to come out and go into the fuselage now, and that will fit. So that is the end of nacelle build for the left side. Of course, I'll just repeat the process on the right side. And if anybody has any questions, comments, I welcome them. Please leave them down in the comments section. And this is Dave with Hobby Barn, the Hobby Barn basement build of the T1 models. Thanks again, and we'll be moving on to probably the wing sections and the servos after I finish the nacelles and get the test fitting done. So I'll see you in the next video.